dear viewers, and welcome to another episode of Indiscretions, the podcast for the politics of discretion. And today I want to talk a little bit about efficacy. Now, this might be a term that you've heard, especially when we get closer to elections like we are now. And the idea that our government, which is a representative government and is supposed to be an embodiment of the public will, that's the idea of a representative. It's someone who is entrusted with listening to their constituents and acting in their interests. And this idea that our elected officials are supposed to respond to the public will, and this is where efficacy comes in. Efficacy effectively means effective. You might have heard this term in relation to science or something like that. The idea of how efficacious something is how effective it is. Parsing that into political terms, it is basically the idea that if a constituent goes to their representative and says, I want a certain policy enacted. So let's say it's a local businessman and they tell their state representative that I think business taxes are too high and it's hurting my business. The idea that that representative then goes into the legislature and introduces a bill and says, I've listened to my constituents and they say that the business tax is too high, so I'm introducing this bill to lower it. And then the legislature will pass that bill, the bill becomes law, and that goes into effect and the business tax is lowered. That is a result, and that business owner then can feel satisfied knowing that their voice was heard and that action was taken as a result of that. So it's the idea that the opinions that constituents have matters. The idea that their representatives are actually listening to them and responding to them and taking actions that take their opinions into consideration. And so this requires a method of representative government that is more oriented around the idea that elected officials, and particularly our representatives in Congress, are bound by the opinions of their constituents. Because there are really two models of representation that we talk about in political science. And informally, what distinguishes them is the idea that representatives are able to make informed decisions about what their constituents think, or whether they simply take into effect what constituents think. So it is a more responsive model versus a more independent model. So if you have an independent member of the legislature, he is not bound to honor an expression of his constituents' will. So you might take a public opinion poll, or you might go into your district if you're a representative and have a town hall meeting or something like that and ask what your constituents' view of a particular subject is. Let's again say it's levels of taxation. If a representative is truly a representative, they are going to take into account the expressed opinions of their constituents and act upon that. So let's say again that this constituency is mostly made up of people who think that the rate of taxation is too high. So the representative, when he goes into Congress and takes a vote, is going to keep that in mind and is going to act in accordance with his constituents' will. He's bound by that opinion, regardless of whether or not lowering tax rates is a net economic positive or negative. And that's when we get into the other model of representation. And this is a model that is maybe a little more elitist, because what it effectively says is the reason that direct democracy doesn't work is because the majority of the people are uninformed about the nuances of a lot of weighty issues that government deals with, and they tend to be more emotionally driven, and this leads to policies that, while they might think they're in their best interest, aren't really if you take things into account. And so This other model of representation says that we elect representatives because they have the time on a daily basis to sit down, to familiarize themselves with the in and outs and the nuances of public policy, and to make decisions that are in their constituents' best interest. So this isn't just representatives responding to the expressed wills of constituents. This is representatives saying, well, I know that I have a constituency that has a lot of businesses of a particular strain in them. So let's say they're from a farming constituency. So they take a look at the in and out of legislation and say, well, I know that because my constituents are farmers, they have a vested interest in certain issues, and I know how these issues are going to play out with legislation because I've studied them, so I'm going to vote a certain way based on what I think is in my constituents' best interest and not necessarily on a way that is in their expressed best interest. So let's go back to the example of a business tax. If a group of constituents come to the representative and say, we think taxes are too high and we want them lowered, well, then the representative may come back to them and say, well, I know you don't like the taxation rate, but if we lower the taxation rate, then we're not going to be taking as much money in, and this means that we can't spend as much on programs. It means there won't be as funding. It's going to contribute to a deficit, and in the long run, it isn't good for the community. So I'm actually going to vote to maintain the taxation rate that you think is too high because I don't like what the effects down the road are. I think they're against your best interest. So it is effectively a more, you could say elitist model, and personally I do think it is a little elitist, but it is more of a trustee model of government and of representation. The idea that the public are voting for someone who is informed on the issues, is informed of their opinions, and is going to take that information, and they are entrusting them to act on that information accordingly and to make their own best guesses about what policies will be in their long-term best interest. So really the difference here is whether or not a representative is bound to strictly follow the whim of their constituents, whether or not they're bound by opinions, or whether or not they have the ability to interpret the opinions of their constituents and to make educated guesses about what they think is or isn't in their best interest based on their more informed position on policies and the likely effect of policies down the road. And the way that efficacy plays into this is, of course, the idea that your representative is actually representing your interests, is responding to what you think is right. So in the trustee model of government, efficacy becomes a slightly more murky issue because representatives are acting with a greater degree of independence and aren't necessarily following their constituents' interests to the letter. So what efficacy means obviously changes depending on how we view the role of government. Do we want a more direct model of representation? Do we want a more democratic model of representation? Now let's not confuse this with direct democracy and the idea that personal will is directly channeled into the actions of government, and that if you have a majority or a plurality of a certain set of people, their personal will becomes law. It is attached to a certain sense of moral right and wrong because the majority should rule. And that becomes a moral force because right and wrong is defined in reference to the will of the majority. There's not any external reference to some more absolute form of morality. There's not any reference to whether or not you're violating the rights of the minority. It's simply an expression of popular will. Popular simply meaning the greatest faction. And it is really just individual will, which is sort of magnified through the majority, so that the individual loses its significance because obviously we're not paying deference to the minority, but it is purely will translated into law. There's no sort of governor upon it. And Efficacy in the sense of we're talking about that channeled through the medium of a representative, so a representative who acts to implement the will of his constituents. Efficacy there means something very different than it does if we're talking about a trustee model of democratic representation. If we're talking about the idea that constituents are entrusting their representatives to understand the interests of their constituents and are trusting them to be able to discern where those interests fit into public policy and the likely implications that that public policy is going to have. Because efficacy, again, is a representation of the self. It is a question of comparing your own ideas about where your interests lie, about how you think the world should be ordered, about how you think politics should be oriented, and the reality of how the legislature or another form of government behaves. Does it meet with your satisfaction? Does it go against your interests? Do you agree with it? All of these questions. And there's a much more direct model from the self to power if we're talking about more direct versions of democracy versus if we're talking about the trustee model of representation, where there is that intermediary body, the representative who has a job of interpreting the will of his constituents and trying to figure out how that best plays into public policy. And the problem that we have with efficacy here is one that is more broad anyway, because we're talking about government, something that by its nature is public, that by its nature deals with overlap between people's interests. Because if we're talking just about an issue where a private individual is by his or herself and has an issue that they want to solve, and it doesn't involve the productive efforts of anyone else, then it is purely up to the individual to take steps to come up to a solution. And efficacy in that sense is purely a measure of whether or not the individual can perform to their own satisfaction. So let's take the example of you as an individual have to get up in the morning, get yourself dressed, get yourself fed, and get to work. In that case, you are dealing with things that are entirely within your control. It is your decision as to how to dress yourself in that morning. It is your decision as to how to feed yourself in that morning. It is your decision as to how to transport yourself to your job in the morning. And all of these things are dealing with private goods. You have purchased the clothes that you wear, you have purchased the food that you're going to eat, you have purchased your car, or you have the money to buy a transportation ticket. So you're talking about things that are entirely within your control. You're talking about goods that because you have purchased them or because you have altered them are your property, are entirely within your control, and no one else has a right to naysay how you do things. And your success or failure is a matter of your discretion, is a matter of your ability to successfully plan. Success or failure is entirely within your control. But when we talk about government, we are not talking about those issues. We are talking about public issues. We're talking about things that are dealing with more than one will, things that are probably dealing with conflating wills, and things that deal with public goods, here defined as something where not necessarily where we're not talking about private ownership, but we're talking about things where private ownership interlaps. So for example, when we're talking about the revenue that government uses to fund its various ventures, to implement public policies, to get the money to have public programs, we're talking about funds that have come from private individuals. It's multiple private individuals who have contributed the money into the federal coffers, obviously by force, but that's an entirely different matter. But we're not talking about necessarily public ownership just because we're talking about public goods. It becomes public by the fact that we're dealing with things that cross the domains of private individuals. It's not simply an issue that's down to one individual's will. The question of who has the authority to control it is at issue because we are dealing with multiple people who need to come to some sort of common agreement as to how to best dispose of the funds. And that means that we're going to have overlap, we're going to have disagreement as to what the best course of action is, and so you need to come up with some sort of compromise position. Usually, of course, in the sense of the United States government, this means that we're talking about a simple plurality or majority opinion, and that's what is going to come out on top. Of course, when we're talking about the federal government and really state and local governments as well, we're talking about respect for individual rights being a limitation upon that as well. And that is where efficacy becomes more of a muddled issue, because efficacy is really a private affair. It's a question of whether or not you are getting your way, whether or not you're satisfied that your voice has been heard, whether or not you are satisfied that your rationale has been taken into consideration. And the question then, does efficacy mean just you're satisfied that your representative has heard your opinion and has taken it into due consideration and has deliberated on it, has brought that to the table when we're talking about legislative bodies? The idea that representatives have, in the course of debating a particular piece of legislation, have said that, well, constituents in my district think A, B, and C. So it's given voice to all of the different opinions that exist, or whether or not they have simply just taken view of the opinion of the majority and said, this is the majority view in my constituency, therefore that's how I'm going to act, and this is the only view that I'm going to give voice to in Congress while we're deliberating on that. Because efficacy needs to be carefully defined so that we're not conflating. Just because you have a will doesn't mean that that will is automatically translated into an effect. And this is something that we have to talk about when we talk about individualism, because people get carried away with the idea that because individuals are self-sovereign and because government is meant to be responsive to the individual, that that can sometimes mean that the individual will is somehow by rights carried into what government does. The idea that if you have a particular opinion and you are absolutely 100% convinced of its moral correctness, that that means that everybody else should be forced to bend to your will, because that is what should inform government opinion. And that's what we have to be careful of, because that's simply not true, because we have to reintroduce this idea of private limitations. The idea that you are sovereign of your own affairs, and that is absolutely 100% true, but that's not true of others, because since everyone is sovereign, that means that individuals have absolute sovereignty within those things that are entirely within their control. But if you're dealing with another area where you're abutting another sovereign individual, we're not talking about purely private affairs anymore. We're now talking about public affairs. And we're talking about that in the sense that you have more than one individual in interaction, and whatever decision arises out of a problem that occurs because two people are at loggerheads needs to come with the volitional participation of all parties who are concerned. And what I mean by that is, let's say that as it's springtime, people are starting to clean up their yards and stuff. So let's say that you have a tree that abuts your neighbor's property. It's planted on your property, but it has branches that overhang your neighbor's property. And he comes to you as spring is coming and says, I want to get this tree trimmed. I want to get it into shape because it's had a rough winter and it's become a liability to my property. And he comes to you because the tree is technically your property because it's planted on your side, but the branches that overhang his property are his responsibility to take care of. And so you have this fundamental issue here where you both have your own private domain and you're both responsible for the things within it, but you have this tree that abridges the properties. And so you have to come to an agreement as to how best to deal with this. And you have the option of either saying to your neighbor, I agree, let's get the tree taken care of, let's split the fee that a landscape architect or someone who takes care of trees, I don't exactly know the terminology, but that whoever we call to come in and take care of the tree will share the costs because both of us are affected and it's in our mutual self-interest. Alternately, let's say that you disagree with your neighbor, you don't want to have anything done with it, and you don't really care about his plight because you don't get along, then he can, go off on his own accord, pay someone to trim the branches on his side of the tree, and the rest just stays up in the air and the issue isn't fully resolved. And both of those are acceptable solutions because, again, you are dealing with private overlap where you have one sovereign individual and another sovereign individual, and there is some sort of issue that affects both of them, and it is up to both of them to come up to a solution. That doesn't mean that you lose your sovereignty, which is what we've just seen in this example. You still retain full control over those things that are yours, but if you're dealing with something in common, you have to have every party who is involved come together and say that they have come to a solution, because you don't lose your sovereignty simply because you're now dealing with a group, simply because you're now dealing with an overlap in issues. And that is where efficacy becomes a little tricky when we're talking about things that occur in politics, particularly when we're talking about things that occur at a federal level, because the constituency at issue here is the nation as a whole, which means you're going to have many, many different perspectives, which means you're going to have many different ideas about the correct way to proceed. And if efficacy here means sort of a direct democratic model of things, and this idea that the government is formed to respond to the people, and I have this particular will and I want government to respond to it, and if it doesn't, I feel aggrieved, I feel like government isn't listening to me, that's a problem, because there is still this governor upon how the federal government can behave. This idea that the federal government is limited by the idea that you cannot infringe anyone else's rights, you cannot impinge someone else's sovereignty, and this is a limitation on efficacy that we don't talk that much about. You need to consider the context, and this is the idea that the federal government is limited by a respect for sovereignty, and that it doesn't matter how many people are in agreement on a particular issue. If that agreement infringes on someone else's sovereignty, then that person has to agree to, I don't want to use the word sacrifice themselves, but maybe agrees to, well, I don't care about this short-term unpleasantness because it's in the long-term good. But that has to come of that individual's volition. And so efficacy is limited by the idea that personal will is not this unlimited thing when we're dealing with public, because we're talking about multiple individuals who are sovereign. Just because we're talking about things on a national level, just because we're talking about public affairs, doesn't mean that that sovereignty that individuals inherently possess goes away. And that is a limitation that government can't get around. If government is going to be responsive to individuals, if it is going to respect individuals, then it cannot take this hardline stance that efficacy means that just because we have a certain number of people who agree that government should do one thing, if that infringes on someone else's rights, then we still can't do it. So the popular will is not this moral force in American government like it would be in a pure direct democracy, where the only real moral authority that exists is simply a majority who agree that we should do this. There is still that dissent, there is still that respect for the rights of those who don't agree. And even if, let's say, for some miraculous reason you have 100% unity on a particular political issue, the entire public agrees that government should do something, it doesn't matter if that's the case if that is an infringement of people's liberty, because the government still can't do that. The government still has to respect that sovereignty. Even if you have individuals who are agreeing to give it up, you still would have to change the fundamental nature of government to reflect that. So popular will and the idea that efficacy is this ultimate gauge for how government behaves, for how well government responds, needs to be tempered by this idea that individual sovereignty is still a limitation. This idea that private individuals who have control over their own person, over their own property, just because we're dealing with a group, just because we're dealing with what we call public, that doesn't mean that that respect, that restraint vanishes. And for that reason, efficacy needs to be perhaps redefined a little so that we are paying attention to the idea that personal will is not some sort of automatic justification for government to do a specific thing. There needs to be that restraint, and that needs to be taken into effect when we talk about public opinion, when we talk about satisfaction with government. The idea that, and particularly the legislature, is meant to be what James Madison called a multiplicity of factions. This idea that you are playing off self-interest against self-interest so that government is checking itself. Even within Congress, we have natural checks and balances. And this is this idea that, yes, self-interest is a motivator, and yes, constituents are supposed to be the driving force behind the way that representatives behave. But because we still have to pay deference to individual sovereignty, because public opinion cannot just be a justification for government to do whatever it wants because the majority of the public thinks that that's the right thing to do, you have factions balancing themselves off against each other. And if they're going to actually do something, they have to come to agreement, which means effectively that you have a bunch of self-interested people who are arguing their cases for their own interests, and they have to argue them in good faith, because you have to delineate the real lines of an argument, the real positives and negatives of what your position is, if you're going to find genuine common ground, if you're going to find a genuine compromise as to what the policy that satisfies the majority is going to be. And I don't like using compromise because this is compromise, I think, suggests that someone has ceded their self-interest, but that's not what is going on here. What's going on is you're finding natural places where self-interest overlaps, and the compromise is to come together on what's in common. It doesn't mean that individuals are ceding anything. It doesn't mean that individuals are betraying their own interests. It means that they just need to find that place in common, which means that they need to argue in good faith and to accurately outline the positives and negatives of their position to find out what they have naturally in common with other people.